Did you know that not all Black Americans trace their ancestry solely to Africa? Schools often teach a version of history that begins with ships and slavery, with ancestors taken from African homelands and brought to America in chains. But buried beneath that narrative is something else, something older. Many Black families have passed down quiet stories for generations, stories about native roots, about ancestors who were here long before Columbus. These aren't myths, they're clues. Clues to a deeper truth that's been pushed aside or deliberately erased. In this video, we uncover the hidden legacy of Native Black Americans and why it changes everything we thought we knew about where we come from. Without further ado, let's begin. For centuries, the identity of Black Americans has been framed almost entirely as descendants of African slaves. While millions of Africans were forcibly brought to America, that is not the full story. Early American history and family traditions suggest a more complex ancestry for many African Americans. Since the colonial era, countless Black families have passed down oral histories about a Native American forebear. Some mention a Cherokee great-grandmother, others remember a Creek grandfather, or speak of Indian blood somewhere in the lineage. These stories were often dismissed as fantasy or confusion, but today they are being taken seriously through both historical records and genetic research. The idea that Black people have Native American roots is not new. It is a truth quietly carried through generations. Take genealogist Michael Lane Jr., for example. He grew up hearing that his family had indigenous heritage. The version of history taught in school never quite matched what he felt inside. In his words, the history he learned did not reflect his true heritage. He instinctively believed that some of his ancestors were not just from Africa, but were also native to the Americas. Over time, he confirmed those old family stories. Many African American households have similar memories that have survived, despite being excluded from official narratives. DNA research has started to validate what these families have long known. One major study showed that more than 5% of Black Americans tested had at least 2% Native American ancestry. This suggests a Native ancestor within the last few generations. Many others carry smaller percentages that point to more distant indigenous roots. What this means is clear. Millions of Black Americans today likely have Native ancestry somewhere in their lineage. These findings match what community historians and independent genealogists have been saying for years. The lives of African Americans and Native peoples did not develop in isolation from one another. From the very start of colonial life, their histories intertwined. Recognizing this heritage disrupts the overly simple idea that Black identity comes from Africa alone. This does not take away from the suffering and resilience of African ancestors. Instead, it adds depth to the story. Understanding that some Black Americans descend from Native peoples reframes their identity as deeply connected to the land itself. These ancestors were not only survivors of the Middle Passage, some were already here. They were the original caretakers of the land, now called the United States. This dual ancestry becomes a source of strength. It offers Black Americans another set of stories to hold on to, those of warriors, healers, farmers, and leaders who walked this land long before European ships ever arrived. As we move forward, we will explore how these connections formed, how they were erased, and how they are being rediscovered today. This history was hidden for a reason. But once it is revealed, it cannot be forgotten. The connection between African and indigenous peoples in America began much earlier than most of us were taught. In fact, Africans arrived in the Americas at nearly the same time as Europeans. Some evidence even suggests their presence before them. Spanish records show that by 1526, decades before Jamestown was founded, enslaved Africans had already landed in what is now the United States. They were brought by a Spanish expedition to the Carolina coast. From the very beginning of European colonization, people of African descent and Native Americans were thrust into a world disrupted by foreign powers. Their lives collided, often in violent circumstances, but also through shared survival and unexpected alliances. As European colonizers moved through the Americas during the 1500s and 1600s, they brought African slaves with them while also confronting the vast networks of indigenous nations. Colonizers tried to pit the two groups against each other, but in many cases, Africans and Native Americans formed alliances of their own. There are accounts from the 1700s that show deep cooperation between the two. During Pontiac's War in 1753, a Detroit resident observed something striking. Native warriors rising up against British settlers were reported to spare Black people and only target white colonists. He wrote that the natives were saving and caressing all the Negroes they encountered instead of harming them. Stories like this terrified slaveholders. They feared what might happen if Native Americans and enslaved Africans joined forces. Their worst fear became real in many places. Indigenous communities often sheltered escaped slaves, offering them safety when no one else would. The Iroquois leader Joseph Brant, for instance, welcomed runaway slaves into his Mohawk community and even encouraged marriage between the two groups. These villages became places of protection, and over time, many served as quiet stops on what would later become the Underground Railroad. Before the Civil War ever began, Native peoples were already offering refuge, forming family ties, and helping Black men and women flee from slavery. The colonial period brought suffering to both groups. Europeans seized land and lives. Native Americans were killed, displaced, and enslaved. That last fact is often left out of textbooks. Tens of thousands of Native people were captured and sold into slavery during the 1600s and 1700s. In English colonies, especially in the South, slave traders profited from selling both Africans and Native Americans. South Carolina became a center for this trade, with colonists exporting up to 50,000 Native captives to the Caribbean and other colonies. On plantations, Native and African slaves often worked and lived side by side. They shared the same punishments, the same labor, and the same hopes of escape. These conditions created real human bonds. Some were forced. Enslavers sometimes placed African men with Native women in hopes of producing children who could survive longer in American conditions. In other cases, the connection was voluntary. Strangers turned into partners. The shared trauma of bondage gave way to love and marriage. Colonial records from the late 1700s show increasing numbers of children born to parents of mixed African and Native ancestry. In some of the most moving stories, Native women used what little power they had to free enslaved African men. They bought their freedom in markets, brought them into their tribes, and started families. The children from these unions were accepted as part of the Native nation. They were born free, members of their mother's people. These examples remind us that Black and Native Americans were not just neighbors. They were kin, allies, and protectors of each other. Over time, these personal ties led to something even more powerful: entire communities built by and for people of mixed heritage. In places like Spanish Florida and French Louisiana, escaped slaves and Native Americans joined together to form maroon settlements in swamps and forests, far from the reach of colonizers. The Seminoles of Florida became one of the most well-known examples. Originally made up of Creek and other southeastern tribes, the Seminoles welcomed runaway Africans into their territory. These escapees, later called Black Seminoles, lived alongside Native families and adopted Seminole customs. They contributed their own skills, language, and music in return. When the United States declared war on the Seminoles, Black and Native warriors fought together. Their unity was so strong that when the government forced the tribe to relocate to Oklahoma, hundreds of Black Seminoles made the journey with them. They stayed together as one people. They had shared the same land, the same struggles, and now shared the same fate. By the 1800s, communities made up of both African and Indigenous people were no longer rare. They had their own customs, languages, and survival tactics. They were not fully African or fully Native in the eyes of outsiders, but inside their homes and towns, they belonged to both worlds. They learned to move through colonial spaces with caution. They became translators, hunters, laborers, warriors. They carried traditions from both bloodlines. This blended identity did not begin in modern times. It began in the very first century of colonization. From the start, many of the ancestors of today's Black Americans were not only from Africa. Some were indigenous to this land. Some were enslaved Africans who found love and freedom among Native people. They built families, raised children, and passed down stories that would survive centuries of silence. These early encounters created something powerful and unique, a legacy of Native Black Americans. It is a legacy that challenges what we thought we knew about America's past. And as we will see in the next part of the story, that legacy came under threat once governments decided to enforce strict rules about who counted as what. Those efforts would shape what people were allowed to remember and what they were forced to forget. If the connection between Black and Native history was once common, then why isn't it part of what we learn today? One major reason is what researchers have called paper genocide. This term refers to the deliberate erasure of a people's identity through official documents and reclassification. In the context of United States history, it meant removing Native American identity from records by labeling individuals of Native ancestry as members of other racial groups, often as Black or Negro. With the stroke of a pen, entire Native lineages disappeared from history. This happened to thousands of Native Black Americans. Their indigenous roots were erased from history books, birth certificates, land records, and census data. From the beginning of American census taking, there was bias in how people of color were labeled. The first federal census in 1790 set the pattern. Census takers relied on visual inspection, not tribal records or cultural affiliation. They used vague and inconsistent labels like Indian, mulatto, Black, or white. A Native American who didn't live on a reservation or who had darker skin could easily be recorded as Negro or mulatto by a government worker who knew nothing of their identity. Over time, this practice lowered the official number of Native Americans and increased the count of Black or mixed-race individuals. Native people with African ancestry were often listed as Black, regardless of how they lived or how their communities identified them. This was not just laziness. In many places, it was policy. State officials and local authorities enforced a strict racial hierarchy. Mixed identities, especially those that challenged white definitions of race, were seen as a threat. The system pushed everyone into rigid categories. There was no space for people who lived between those lines. A chilling example of this happened in Virginia. In 1924, the state passed the Racial Integrity Act. Its goal was to preserve so-called racial purity by banning interracial marriage and reducing racial categories to just white or colored. For white supremacists of that time, even acknowledging Native Americans as a distinct group was seen as too complicated. One man, Walter Plecker, took this to an extreme. He served as Virginia's Registrar of Vital Statistics. With his position, he rewrote the racial identities of thousands of people. He claimed that all real Indians in Virginia had died off. Those who said they were Indian, he argued, were actually just Black people trying to hide behind a Native label. Plecker didn't just talk, he acted. He went into old records and physically changed racial designations. Families who had been listed as Indian for generations suddenly found that new documents said they were colored. He threatened midwives and clerks who disagreed. He ordered them to record any person with African features as colored, no matter what their family or community said. He referred to Native descendants as Negroes and feathers, mocking their identity. By the time he was done, hundreds of records were altered. Entire communities that had called themselves Chickahominy, Monacan, or Pamunkey were now listed as Black on every official paper. The immediate of the Creek Nation Supreme Court. Yet after Oklahoma joined the United States, his name began showing up in records as Negro instead of Indian. This was not an accident. Census takers who saw his dark skin made a judgment. They labeled him Black, ignoring his position and heritage. If this could happen to a man of high status, imagine how many others were misclassified in silence. For their descendants, the only identity left in official files was African American. The Native side vanished from the paperwork. The Dawes Rolls present another example. At the turn of the 20th century, the U.S. government created these rolls to determine who belonged to the 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole. Black members of these tribes, many of whom were formerly enslaved by tribal leaders, were recorded on separate freedmen rolls. Even if they had Native ancestry, registrars often did not include it. Some did not ask. Some refused to believe it. Later, when tribal citizenship laws were rewritten, only people with an ancestor listed as Indian by blood could be recognized. The descendants of freedmen, even if they carried Native lineage, were shut out. This reinforced the false idea that Black and Native identities had no overlap. Even when historical records and family stories told a different story. The impacts of paper genocide has shaped generations. When Native Black Americans were relabeled as Black, their contributions to Native history were pushed out of sight. Their names disappeared from tribal lists. Their stories were excluded from textbooks. Families who once proudly claimed indigenous roots now hesitated to speak of them. Talking about Indian heritage could invite legal trouble, social ridicule, or accusations of dishonesty. Under the shadow of Jim Crow laws, many chose silence. Still, not all knowledge was lost. In some homes, photographs of a great-grandparent who looked distinctly Native remained tucked in drawers. Some elders whispered that their people had once been Creek or Choctaw. The stories survived in fragments. They were rarely shared in public, but they lived in memory. Now, with digital records and DNA testing, many Black Americans are confirming what their grandparents always said. They are finding the names, places, and documents that prove their indigenous roots were never imagined. The history was real. It was just erased on paper. This phase of erasure is not just a footnote. It helps explain why so many today do not know they are descendants of America's first peoples. The past was altered deliberately, but truth has a way of returning. What was hidden is being uncovered. And once revealed, it becomes part of a fuller and more honest story of Black identity in America. Despite the forces that tried to separate Black and Native identities, the connection endured. It lives through family stories, cultural practices, and shared bloodlines. Today, the legacy of that connection can still be seen and felt in many Black communities. One of the clearest signs of this shared heritage is what people are finding through genealogical research. As records have become more accessible, Black Americans are uncovering Native ancestry in tribal rolls, treaties, and old census data. Some ancestors were labeled colored in federal records, but identified as members of Native nations in family Bibles or local archives. Michael Lane Jr. is a powerful example. Guided by family stories, he traced his lineage and discovered that several of his ancestors were listed on the Dawes rolls of the Muskogee Creek Nation. In 2020, years, Black participants have formed tribes, crafting elaborate feathered suits and performing chants and dances inspired by Native ceremonies. These acts are not costumes. They are public declarations of gratitude and memory. The influence extends beyond festivals. In parts of the South, African American healing practices, food, and speech contain elements passed down from Native neighbors. Corn-based dishes, herbal remedies, and even some regional dialect words reveal how these cultures once learned from each other. In places like Florida and Oklahoma, the Black Seminoles developed their own Creole language, a mix of African, Native, and English influences. Some communities have held on to this dual identity for generations, even when the outside world refused to acknowledge them. The Melungeons in Appalachia, the Lumbee tribe, and the Shinnecock Nation in New York include many families with African, Native, and sometimes European roots. These groups were often pressured to choose one identity or erase from official recognition altogether, but they persisted. Today, they are being acknowledged for who they are. Even major historical figures carried this blend of heritage. Langston Hughes had both African and Native ancestry, and he mentioned it in his writings. Frederick Douglass spoke of possible Native roots, though this part of his story was often overlooked. In modern times, writers like Ta-Nehisi Coates have referenced Native ancestry in their own families. These stories remind us that this heritage has always existed, whether or not it was recognized. This is not just about history. Recognizing shared ancestry opens the door for healing and unity. Both Black and Native communities were targeted by colonial violence. Both lost land, rights, and lives to the same systems of power. The official narrative often kept their struggles apart, but the lived reality was different. Understanding these connections can build bridges. When a Black American learns that a great-grandparent was Creek or Choctaw, it can inspire deeper interest in Native issues. When tribes acknowledge Black members, such as the Cherokee Nation did with the descendants of their freedmen, it restores relationships that were broken by politics and racism. This heritage is not a relic. It exists today in DNA results, family photos, Mardi Gras parades, and tribal enrollment documents. It lives in languages created by people who had no homeland except each other. It's in food, music, prayer, and the stories passed. It's down quietly from grandparent to child. Recognizing this truth does not diminish the African roots of Black Americans, it expands them. It honors ancestors who walked both paths, those who crossed oceans and those who stood on this soil long before borders existed. This part of history adds strength to the story of Black identity. It shows that Black Americans have roots not only in survival, but in belonging to more than one people, more than one legacy, and that is something powerful to carry forward. Across the country, more Black Americans are rediscovering Native ancestry once buried beneath census labels and forgotten stories. With DNA testing, online records, and digitized archives, long-dismissed family legends are finally being confirmed. These tools have sparked a quiet revolution, one where African Americans are uncovering links to tribes, freedmen roles, and Indian Territory histories that connect them to this land in a deeper way. For some, the discovery fills a gap they've always felt. It validates what elders once whispered. For others, it reshapes their entire sense of identity. Stories once considered hearsay now have names, dates, and documentation. Scholars and historians are also stepping in, creating books, exhibits, and college courses that center Black Indigenous experiences. This renewed attention is lifting the veil on a legacy hidden in plain sight. Figures like Michael Lane Jr. are helping lead the way. After tracing his lineage to the Muskogee Creek Nation and gaining recognition, he began guiding others on how to reclaim theirs. His message is simple: you were never just one thing, and you were never alone. Afro Indigenous community groups are growing stronger, demanding acknowledgement from both tribal councils and federal institutions. This movement is about more than heritage, it's about healing. It brings together the descendants of enslaved Africans and displaced Native peoples, two groups who endured the worst of American policy and survived. When these connections are embraced, it unites histories that were always intertwined. The impact is cultural, political, and deeply personal. What we're seeing now is not a trend. It's a return. A return to origin stories that were interrupted but not erased. A return to names, lands, and bloodlines that belong to us. And in that return, Black America finds not just truth, but power. If this video gave you something to think about, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There's so much more history they never wanted us to know, and we're just getting started. Stay locked in with Black Culture Unlocked. Take care, and we'll see you in the next one.